Welcome to episode 18 of the SaaS Report. I'm your host, Matt Aird, founder at Sales Science. And today we're going to be looking at Q1 results from Rubrik, Asana, CrowdStrike, and MongoDB. Then we're going to be taking a look at the brand new feature release from iOS on their new iOS 26 update that's going to allow people to have an agent or effectively a digital gatekeeper kind of screen the calls before they come in. So we're going to talk about some of the implications that might have for teams running outbound, of which we are one of them. And then finally, we're going to close off with another story related to Apple. And this is in relation to a paper that they released recently, breaking down the limitations of these large reasoning models and where they run into trouble and what some of the implications might be for SaaS companies. So let's get into it. Rubrik reported Q1 results this week, and they are absolutely flying at the moment. ARR growth came in at 54% year over year in Q1. Look at these ARR growth rates over the last 6 quarters, just absolutely phenomenal, have been sitting somewhere between 50 and 60% ARR growth for the last 6 quarters now. They added about $375 million in net new ARR over the last 12 months. That takes them to over $1 billion in ARR run rate now. And they spent about $658 million on sales and marketing to generate that growth. That gives them CAC payback over the last 12 months of about 27 months. Now, Rubrik is a company that isn't shy about investing in go-to-market. As a percentage of revenue, they spent 61% on sales and marketing in Q1. And if you can believe it, that's actually down slightly compared to the last few quarters. They got as high as 74% in Q4 of 2023. One of the key factors to their growth is their really high net revenue retention rate. So NRR came in at 120%. For Q1, that's significantly higher than the median that we see across the companies that we track. That's been trending down slightly over the last few quarters and sits somewhere around about 110% for those companies that report that metric. Some other metrics to note: free cash flow margin came in at 12% for Q1. They had 332,000 in ARR per employee. Rule of X came in at 120, but still running pretty big operating losses. Operating loss came in at 93 million for the quarter, or about 33% of revenue. So still running pretty large operating losses there. So Rubrik is bucking the trend in a lot of ways, right? Really high NRR, really high growth rates for this environment, but still big operating losses and still pretty low or comparatively low free cash flow margins. They're trading at a market cap of about 18 billion, or about 17 times Q1 ARR. Asana reported Q1 results this week, and they're one of the SaaS companies that are really struggling to find growth over the last little bit. I'd throw them in kind of the same bucket as companies like UiPath, Okta, DocuSign, right? These kind of legacy SaaS companies that are really struggling to find their way. If we rewind to the beginning of 2022, Asana was a hyper-growth SaaS company, right? Growing north of 50% ARR. And since that point, we've just seen ARR growth completely fall through the floor, and that's started to flatline now around 9 or 10%. To give you some perspective on their go-to-market efficiency, they've generated just under 60 million in net new ARR over the last 12 months, and that came off the back of $420 million in sales and marketing spend. So that gives them CAC payback of a brutal 94 months. And one of the things that's making it really hard for them to generate growth is their net revenue retention rate. So that's fallen under 100% now. It came in at 95% for the quarter. And on top of the go-to-market efficiency struggles, they're also struggling from just a business operational efficiency standpoint. Had pretty large operating losses, so operating margin was negative 23% for Q1. Free cash flow margin was just 2%. But they are making some strides here, right? We saw pretty big cuts to OpEx in Q1 year over year. R&D spending was down by 9%. Sales and marketing spending was down 4%. That took total OpEx to about 113% of Q1 revenue. That's down from 128% in Q1 last year. So pretty challenging for Asana right now. They've got a market cap of 3.5 billion, or about 4.6 times Q1 ARR. We got Q1 numbers from MongoDB, and they were solid as kind of expected. they added 378 million in net new ARR over the last 12 months. And that's pretty good in this operating environment, right? As more and more of these reports come out, most companies are struggling to generate net new ARR growth. MongoDB doesn't seem to have that problem. If we look back over the last few quarters, they've been very consistent at delivering somewhere between, 3 and 400 million in net new ARR year after year. They had CAC payback of 37 months over the last 12 months, which is pretty consistent, right? Compared to the last few quarters, basically flat year over year. And digging into the income statement a little bit more, we can see that they've pulled back pretty significantly on sales and marketing spend. In Q1 of last year, that came in at 49% of revenue. That's down to 40% of revenue in Q1 this year. R&D spending was down a point as well, and G&A spending was down 3 points. That made operating margins a little bit better, although they are still negative. So they came in at negative 10% for the quarter. Some other metrics of note: free cash flow margin came in at 19%. Rule of 40 was at 41. Rule of X at 63. RPO came in at 774 million. So that was actually up 32% year over year, which is a really good sign for future revenue growth and ARR growth. They've got a market cap of about 18 billion, or about 9 times Q1 ARR. CrowdStrike, they added 714 million in net new ARR over the last 12 months. Not bad at all for a company that shut down half the world's computers just a few months ago. That represented about 20% ARR growth year over year. To generate that 714 million in net new ARR, they spent about 1.5 billion over the last 4 quarters on sales and marketing. So that gives them CAC payback of about 33 months over the last 12 months. Pretty good. In this operating environment, as we're seeing across the companies that we track, we're starting to see these CAC payback rates push up. We did see a bit of a blowout in OpEx and consequently operating margins. So in Q1 of last year, they had a 1% operating margin. That collapsed to negative 11% in Q1 this year. That came on the back of increases across all major OpEx items. So sales and marketing was up to 40% of revenue from 38. R&D was up to 30 from 26% of revenue, and G&A jumped to 15% of revenue from 11 a year ago. Despite that, they still had really strong free cash flow margins, so that came in at 25%. They've got $415,000 in ARR per employee and delivered a really impressive jump in remaining performance obligations. So that was up 45% year over year, which is a great sign for future revenue growth. And when we look at this chart, right, this has been progressing really nicely over the last few quarters, from 4.9 up to about 6.8 billion in Q1 this year. They're one of the few companies that we track that report on gross revenue retention. That came in at 97% for the quarter, which is really strong. They've got a market cap of about 115 billion, which is quite a premium. They're trading at about 27 times Q1 ARR. Right, onto our first main story of today, and news came out last night, so as I'm recording this, that in the new iOS 26 update, Apple is rolling out a call screening feature. So anyone that's been cold calling for a while will have encountered this on people that use the kind of Google Voice screening assistant. Basically what happens is you call someone's mobile, and instead of getting them, you interact with an agent who says, "Tell me your name and the reason for your call, and then I'll try to connect you." Basically, what this is going to allow them to do is to get a short summary of who's calling, and then allow them to decide whether or not they want to take that call. Now, regardless of how you chop this up, this is going to have pretty big implications for organizations that do outbound, especially those that have cold calling as a large part of that go-to-market motion. So iOS or Apple devices, right, have about a 60% market share in the US and in Australia, and about a 45% market share in New Zealand. If you broke this down by kind of executives, right, or senior executives at kind of the organizations that most of us are trying to sell to, you could probably imagine that iOS penetration or iPhone penetration is even higher than that. So what I wanted to do today is kind of break down some of the implications of this change. Now, bearing in mind that it looks like this feature is going to be kind of like opt-in, right? You're going to have to go in and turn this on. And so not everyone will do that. But I think there will be a decent percentage of the population that decides to switch this on, right? So how is that going to impact teams that use cold calling in their go-to-market motions? The first change that I see is I think that parallel dialing, so using tools like Orem or Salesfinity, become much less effective than they are today. The way that these parallel dialers work is that they only connect you, the person calling, with the prospect once a live connect takes place. If no live connect takes place, right, you don't get dropped into that call. In their current form, the parallel dialers aren't going to answer those questions, and therefore the call is going to simply be terminated before you get patched through. Now, this could be a fairly easy change for these platforms to make, right, which is that if they get served with that request, right, they just patch the user through so that the person making the dials can respond to those queries with the hope that they get put through. It's going to create some inefficiencies, right? The reps are going to be spending a lot more time talking to these kind of voice agents as opposed to prospects, but that could be one way to allow companies like Aurum and Salesfinity to continue to put their users into conversations, or at least give them a chance to get into those conversations with prospects, right? But it's going to add another layer of complication or inefficiency to the process compared to how it runs today. The other spin on this is that the platforms like Aurum and Salesfinity could potentially answer those questions for you, right? And there's kind of two ways that they could do that, right? One would be a really basic kind of canned pitch that they could deliver in response to that query, right? And that could be the same for every person, regardless of, who you're approaching. The other is that they could potentially use an AI agent to deliver a personalized or customized response to that query that ties into something they've found about the prospect, right? And the value prop of the caller or the reason for the call, right? So you can imagine that the companies that do this well could really add a bunch of innovation here to help callers get connected with prospects through using AI to communicate with the AI effectively in a way that, gets a patch through or gets you connected to the person that you want to speak to, right? But I think overall there has to be some change here, right? The parallel dialers in their current form are going to be much less effective in this new state than they are today. So that's implication number one. Number two is that I think what this does is that it means the connect rates will decline from where they are today, right? Regardless of the adoption rates here, you're going to get some people that turn this feature on and therefore use this feature to screen all of their incoming calls. And what that means is that live connect rates are going to decrease, right? It's very difficult to come up with a, 5 to 10 second elevator pitch that's going to convince a prospect to pick up the phone and speak to you, right? When they now know that it's a cold call, right? Yes, there's some things that you can do here to make sure that it's well researched, that you have a legitimate reason for reaching out. You could be super creative in the way that you craft these things. But regardless of that, I think that live connect rates will diminish as a result of this feature being rolled out by iOS. Now, this reduction in connect rates kind of isn't really something new. I think anyone in the industry is kind of predicting that connect rates will continue to reduce over time. And the reason for that is that as you get, more millennials, more Gen Zs into these kind of senior decision-making roles within organizations, those generations are much less likely to pick up the phone when people call them and they don't recognize the number, right? Gen X, baby boomers, much more likely to do that. Younger generations, much less likely to do so. And so this may accelerate some of that connect rate decline, but I think we all knew, anyone that's been in the industry all knew that this was kind of going to trend down over time anyway. Right. Third thing is that business lines, direct dial lines through an IVR or through a directory may become really important again. Over the last few years, we've seen this massive shift to the point where, you've got reps thinking, unless it's a mobile number, there's no point in calling it, right? Unless I've got mobile data, I'm wasting my time. We may see that this shifts back again the other way because these IVRs and these directories may not have these agents kind of screening those calls, right? If you can find a way to get patched through to your prospect's direct dial line, you may have a more direct path into speaking to them than you do if you have to try to navigate these iOS agents. The final implication here is I think that cold calling becomes much less kind of spray and pray. What we've seen over the last few years with the proliferation of tools like Aurum and Salesfinity, Connect and Sell to a certain degree as well, is that cold calling strategy was really just kind of volume based, right? If you just put enough of your ICP prospects into these dialers and you spend enough time on the dialer, you were going to get into enough conversations to kind of hit pipeline targets, right? Because you were going to get enough live connects and you were going to be able to kind of, using the math or the numbers, right, just get through kind of brute force your way to the outcomes you're after. I think that's going to be much less possible in this new future state. And so cold calling is going to become a much more kind of targeted piece of the outbound motion, right? It's going to become much more a precision weapon and much less kind of a volume play. The reason for that is that if you want to be able to get patched through these kind of, digital gatekeepers, so to speak, you're going to have to be able to articulate in 5 to 10 seconds exactly why this person should want to speak to you. And it's very difficult to do that if your response to those questions is the same to all, 5,000 prospects that you're trying to reach. If you have a specific individualized reason for why you're reaching out to this particular person, then I think your chances of a connect go way up, right? For example, right, if you're getting screened by let's call it the Apple gatekeeper, they say, state your name and the reason why you've called, and I'll try to connect you. If your response is, hey, I spoke to John and Susie. They told me that LinkedIn outbound was becoming a bigger part of your go-to-market process. Wanted to share some insights around what we're seeing work on this channel at the moment. Right now, if you actually have that insight from John and Susie and you're calling their boss, chances are, or at least the likelihood of you getting connected are much better, right? Than if you simply called a random person and said, hey, we help organizations to improve their LinkedIn outbound approach. Wanted to share some information with you on that. So I think the cold call or the phone becomes a much more kind of like precise targeted weapon than it does a kind of spray and pray kind of tool in the way that most organizations are going to be using it today. So final observation here is I think that this change will actually be good for the industry. One of the things that buyers are probably struggling with is just like the amount of noise that's out there. And it's difficult to kind of filter all of the noise from the signal if you're a buyer at the moment. By introducing this kind of gate, what that's going to mean is that sellers are going to have to get much more intentional about who they decide to reach out to and how. And I think that that means overall, we get kind of a win-win outcome, right? Sellers are more targeted in the way that they're approaching buyers. Buyers get less kind of untargeted kind of noise and much more signal, which means that they're probably more likely to respond to the stuff that stands out to them. All right, final thing I want to cover today is another Apple story, which is weird. I don't think we've covered Apple at all over the course of this podcast, and now we've got them twice in one episode. But there was some news coming out this week that Apple's released a paper showing some of the limitations of these large language reasoning models. Now, if you've been playing around with things like ChatGPT, you've probably played with the, O3 or O4 reasoning models, right? And so these are the tools that kind of show they're working as they're generating an answer for you. Now, the paper that Apple put out is titled The Illusion of Thinking, Understanding the Strengths and Limitations of Reasoning Models via the Lens of Problem Complexity. So that's a bit of a mouthful. Basically, what they wanted to test was how much better these reasoning models are compared to the more traditional kind of LLMs that we're familiar with at solving problems of different complexity levels. So when you use these reasoning models like O3 or O4, what they do is that they show you what they call a chain of thought, right? So you can kind of see the steps that the model is taking in order to try to respond to your query or answer your question. And the claim behind why they were developing the models to do this is that this chain of thought allows these models to solve much more challenging problems. And this was backed up initially by some of the benchmarking tests, right? So if you've looked in the space at all, you know that all of these companies basically submit their LLMs or their LRMs to these benchmarking tests, which means they have to go in and solve certain problems or respond to certain queries, and then they're graded on their ability to be able to do so, right? As a result of that kind of grading in those tests, it showed that these reasoning models were more effective at solving some of these more challenging problems. Right. So the AI community, understandably, has kind of been very excited about this based on the fact that it looks like this is going to create a path to be able to get to kind of AGI, right? The idea is like, okay, we have the first generation of LLMs, which are kind of like just reply with tokens kind of without too much thought. Then we've got these reasoning models, which kind of try to think through the problem, which can solve problems of greater complexity, right? And then the idea is, well, hey, if we can just build bigger models, bigger LRMs with more data and throw more compute at them, right? If we just keep doing that, then potentially we get to this, utopia, which is AGI. So Apple in this paper basically set out to answer the question, right? Do these fancy thought traces equal real reasoning, or are they just kind of like better looking guesswork essentially, right? And so the way that they tested this, so Apple took classic logic puzzles, things like Tower of Hanoi or river crossings or word ladders, and basically what they did was that they turned up the complexity on these challenges kind of like one knob at a time. And here's basically what they found, right? So on the low complexity problems, so on the puzzles that were kind of easy to solve, the LLMs often beat the LRMs, right? The reasoning models. And the reason for that was that the LRMs basically just wasted tokens, kind of over explaining the easy moves. They're overcomplicating it, right? Where the LLMs just go, oh yeah, this is straightforward, here's the answer. The LRMs try to explain, every step they were taking, which was kind of unnecessary. When we get to medium complexity, the LRMs shone, right? So the extra steps that the LRMs took helped to map out the solution space, and they achieved really good outcomes. But what they found when they got to these high complexity problems is that the accuracy really collapsed, right? So both model types tanked to what they called near zero completeness. And even worse, right, the LRMs, they actually think less on these problems, right? So token usage for reasoning was dropping right when the puzzle got the hardest. And so you can imagine like you've got a chart basically, right? Along the bottom, you've got the difficulty of the problem, and then you've got kind of the amount of tokens used by the model over time, and it's increasing up and to the right. And then you get to the certain level of complexity and the chart just completely collapses. And then what happened was even when they injected the correct algorithm, right, into the reasoning model to help it solve the problem, it just ignored that. And so what does this mean? Well, it means that these reasoning models may not be as good at solving some of the more complex problems as we thought. It may be that the kind of the underlying architecture or design of these large reasoning models isn't going to be sufficient in order to get us to the outcomes that we want to get to. Gary Marcus, a professor from NYU and a pretty vocal, kind of outspoken AI hype critic, he said that anybody who thinks LLMs are a direct route to the sort of AGI that could fundamentally transform society for the good is kidding themselves. So what we've seen here is really, I think, the first really public announcement that the way that these organizations, companies like OpenAI, companies like Anthropic, like Google, the way that they're pursuing advancement in AI will likely hit a scaling wall. That is that just throwing greater model capacity, more data, more compute at the problems isn't going to get us to the outcomes that we want to be able to get to, right? On the flip side, it shows us that on the kind of simple tasks and the kind of medium level complexity tasks, LLMs and LRMs are actually really good at solving those problems, right? But on the more complex stuff, right, we haven't figured that out yet. And so if we're thinking about how to incorporate this stuff into our day-to-day, it may be that, the stuff that requires kind of very simple reasoning or simple logic to kind of overcome, we can throw that to the LLMs and the LRMs. But for anything more difficult, right, we probably still need a human in the loop. And this comes back to the idea that like not every problem needs to have an agentic solution, right? Or a solution that's kind of an LLM or an LRM in a wrapper. There are still problems that we can just solve through kind of deterministic workflows, right? And if we can solve it through deterministic workflows, then we should probably take that approach, right? By doing that, we remove kind of all the hallucinations and the inaccuracy that can come from relying on these models too much. All right, so that's it for this week. Thanks for tuning in. If you've watched this far and you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. I think we're really close to 200 subscribers. It'd be awesome to cross that milestone on YouTube. I'll see you again here next week. Just a quick update before I go. The Q1 status SaaS metrics report is going to be live very shortly. I think we're just waiting on one or two more companies to report Q1 results. Then we'll have all of the data, and then we're going to be able to go in and start to chop up that data to provide the insights that you guys are all waiting for. So that'll be done shortly. Keep an eye out for that. I'll see you here again next week. Until then, goodbye.